Lo, I promised you a second video today, continuing meditation on today's gospel for the Friday of the 10th week. I just wanted to meditate on the last two verses of the gospel. Jesus is giving the Sermon on the Mount. He's using this rabbinical tool called an antithesis. And verses 31 and 32 of the 5th chapter of St. Matthew go like this. It was also said, whoever divorces his wife, let him give her a certificate of divorce. But I say to you, that everyone who divorces his wife, except on the ground of unchastity, porneia in Greek, makes her an adulteress, and whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery. Jesus prohibits divorce, which had been permitted under the Mosaic law if you cross-reference Deuteronomy chapter 24, verse 1. In Jewish society, men could divorce women simply by writing a decree of divorce. And there were two schools of thought, the school of Hillel and that of Shammai. The school of Hillel permitted divorce for any reason whatsoever. They interpreted the word porneia, unchastity, in a very broad sense, whereas the school of Shammai permitted divorce only for sexual misconduct. While some might interpret Jesus' saying here as siding with the school of Shammai, I believe that they are mistaken. Again, Jesus here is interested in not abolishing the law, but fulfilling it, strengthening the law, intensifying it for his disciples. He deepens the call to love by prohibiting divorce. It's clear from Mark chapter 10, verses 2 through 12, or Luke chapter 16, verse 8, or 1 Corinthians 7, 10, and 11, or a second time in Matthew's Gospel, chapter 19, verses 3 through 9, that Jesus' prohibition of divorce is absolute. Moses had permitted divorce because of the hardness of people's hearts, but it was not so from the beginning. One of the great difficulties of Moses' day and of our day is that women were often left impoverished by divorce, and they were forced to either remarry for their own survival or for the survival of their children, or simply live with another man. In prohibiting divorce, Jesus seeks to restore marriage to its original dignity, as it was in the beginning, when man and woman were equal partners. In prohibiting divorce, Jesus is indicating that what God has joined together, man must not put asunder. Jesus wants to emphasize the radical and permanent love that God has for his people. God's love is a covenantal love. And Jesus wants human love to imitate and to be caught up in that divine love. Now, as Catholics, we interpret this particular passage in a very particular way, because Matthew says, but I say that everyone who divorces his wife except on the ground of unchastity makes her an adulteress. St. Matthew uses a particular Greek word to indicate adultery, right? He uses, typically when he's referring to adultery, he uses the word moikeia, which we would normally call adultery or fornication. But here in this context, he uses the word porneia, which in all likelihood refers to the fact that many Gentiles who later sought baptism had been in what we would today call incestuous marriages. It was these people in Matthew's community who were permitted to remarry. This was a primitive form of what we might call an annulment or dissolution. I would say Jesus' prohibition of divorce and remarriage is clear from the scriptures. But we must confront a pastoral problem. Too many marriages end in divorce, and too many Catholic marriages end in divorce. And too many Catholics who are divorced stay away from the church, or they remarry, or they go to a church of a different denomination. And so we face some critical questions. How can we as a parish better support married couples, especially newly married couples, so that they succeed in the life they've undertaken? How can we invite those who have gone through a divorce back to church, back to the sacraments? Do we do enough? Do we do anything at all to support those who have been victims of divorce, adultery, or abandonment? At the same time, however, we also have a duty to be faithful to the scriptures, to Jesus' authoritative word. We can't just say divorce and remarriage is okay. I don't have all the answers, but it's important that we begin to think about a pastoral response to the problem and to accompany these individuals. In my first parish, early on in my priesthood, there was on Tuesday nights after teaching RCIA classes, the pastoral team and I would go out and we'd have chicken wings. And one evening, a woman came up to me and said, "Oh, Father, the man with whom I've been living, he really needs to talk to a priest. He really needs to get to church." But I noted immediately, she didn't say my husband. I said, "Well, send him over here. Send him over here." So he came over, and I could see everyone oohing and ahhing and reading their lips at the other table like, "Oh, you're in trouble now." The man came over and he said, "Oh, Father, I really do want to talk to you, but I had too much to drink tonight, and it really wouldn't be good to talk now." I said, "Well, write down your name and number on this piece of paper here. I'll give you a call back. I promise." So the next day I called him, and when I didn't hear from him, a week later I called him again, and a week later I called him again, and I never got any answer. But his ex-wife called me and said, "Father, my children heard your messages on his answering machine, and they're really happy that you called. He really does need to get back to church. In fact, we've already gone through the annulment process, so he's free to get married, but he needs God in his life." So I called again, and then the woman who had approached me at the Wings place answered and said, "Father, why don't you come on over for dinner?" So I went over to their house for dinner and had a nice dinner with them. But the man said to me, "Father, you're the first priest who's actually called me or visited me in 3 years. I used to come to Mass every Sunday. I was an usher, went through a divorce. I felt very low. I couldn't look at anybody in the eye. I didn't know what to do. I even moved back in with my parents for a little while. And they sent the envelopes, all the mailings from the parish to the wrong address. I just feel like I've been forgotten about." Well, I told him then, "Well, we didn't forget about you, and we're going to try, and we will do better, and I will help you." I said, "Why don't you consider getting married in the church?" And he thought about it, and then he said, "Well, I got to go now, Father." It was convenient. He had to take one of his boys to soccer practice. But the woman was left there, and she said, "Well, Father, what about getting married? Do you think we could get married outside?" I said, "I don't think you could get married outside, but I think you could get married in the church. I'll help you." So that began a process for them. But why did it take so long to begin that process? How can people like that simply fall through the cracks? In that sense, all of us need to be pastorally more attentive. We need to develop a pastoral heart, a heart like Jesus's. And June is the month of the Sacred Heart of Jesus. Jesus wants to emphasize the radical and permanent love that God has for his people. And he showed the depths of that love on the cross when his side was pierced and the Sacred Heart was revealed. The radical love which God has for his people is symbolized in the heart of Jesus. In order for us to be fit for our mission, we need to study this heart, which issues forth flames of love for men and women. And then we need to look into our own heart, to purge that which is contrary to the Spirit of Christ. We must learn to love all those whom Jesus loves, even those who aren't perfect or those who are wounded, if we really are serious about being the friend of Jesus. Today, Jesus holds his Sacred Heart out to us. He holds his heart out to us and says, "Behold this heart of mine, on fire with love for humanity." We must hold our own heart up to the Father. Can we re-echo the words of the Master? "Behold this heart of mine, on fire with love." What does that mean, to hold one's heart up to the Lord? Jesus taught his apostles what it meant on his last night with them. And he outlined 3 virtues that should characterize his true friend. The first trait of the friend of the heart of Jesus is unworldliness. "The prince of this world comes, and in me he has nothing. You will lament and mourn, and the world will rejoice. Fear not, I have overcome the world. If you have been of the world will love its own, but because you are not of the world, and I have chosen you out of the world hates you. If the world hates you, know that it hated me before you. No disciple is greater than his master. If they have hated me, they will also hate you." Yes, Jesus went forth toward his passion with contempt for the world and its standards. The heart modeled after the Sacred Heart of Jesus must be stamped by unworldliness. It's the worldly spirit that wrecked many priests even, and through him many others. Judas sold Jesus to the high priests, and this was a contract made between priests because they were mastered by the spirit of the world. St. Ignatius of Loyola, when he was injured and reading about the saints, he asked, "Can I not do what they have done?" And it is easy for us to critique others and their worldly lifestyles with their fatal contracts. But we might ask ourselves Ignatius' question: what they have done, could not I also do? And so we need to purge the spirit of worldliness. The second trait of the friend of the Sacred Heart of Jesus is an understanding of the truth that Christ has a personal tenderness and affection for each of us. Christ wants to be able, in turn, to take for granted that he is also loved by his children. He is the vine and we are the branches. We are his little children. He no longer calls us slaves, but friends. And at the Last Supper, he mentions that his chalice will be poured out for you and for many. He is eager to love us and he's eager to be loved by us. If you love me, keep my commandments. He that loves me shall be loved by my Father. The Father himself loves you, because you have loved me. And in his passion, Jesus shows the depths of his love, walking from the Last Supper in the cenacle to Gethsemane to Jerusalem. What are we willing to do for his love? He models for us the need to be self-sacrificing in our love. And everyone must make a choice whether we will love in this way or not. It's difficult sometimes to love, but we must ask God for the grace to stretch our love. The third trait of the friend of the heart of the Sacred Heart of Jesus is not merely understanding the love of Jesus and the duty to love, but actually loving the brethren. And that will be the proof of our love for Jesus. This is my commandment, that you love one another as I have loved you. By this shall all men know that you are my disciples, that you will love one another. There will be times when living the faith will prove difficult for us, and that it'll be hard to love somebody who's hurt us. And these will be the real tests of our love. St. Noel Chabanel went as a Jesuit missionary to North America, and he tried to master all the Indian languages, and he failed miserably. And he went into his little chapel and knelt before the Blessed Sacrament, and he made a vow that he would never leave the mission of his own free will. And he kept his vow out of love for God and for the native peoples, and he met a martyr's death. St. Catherine of Siena used to care for an old woman whom no one else could stand, and this nasty creature would spread lies about Catherine. But Catherine responded by trying to love her all the more. And that's the sort of thing that fashions the heart, our hearts, after the pattern shown by the Divine Master. St. Therese, the little flower, says, without love, the most brilliant deeds are nothing. Correspondingly, the most insignificant deeds, if done with love, take on stupendous value. My dearest, if God has so loved us, we ought also to love one another. St. John writes these words, we ought to love one another. Where then is there room in our lives for cynicism, for judgmentalness, for studied coldness towards another, for obstinacy that insists on having its own way, for the refusal to forgive or even to speak to one who has offended us, for a bitter remark spoken at someone who has some other plan than our plan? If today you were to hold up your heart up to the eternal Father, would there be a reflection of the divine ray of the Sacred Heart of Jesus, a ray of divine mercy? Perhaps this evening what should motivate us to love more deeply is gratitude. Spend some time reflecting on how God has blessed you, how he has loved you and shown you his mercy. What will you offer in return for his love? There are many people hurting in our world who are thirsting for even a drop of love. Even from the cross, Jesus says, I thirst. And he's thirsting for your love. May God bless you.